The first thing I saw when I pulled back into town was that gate. Big black iron bars, stone columns on both sides, little keypad glowing blue like something out of a gated celebrity neighborhood, and I just sat there in my truck staring at it because I knew, right away, something wasn't right. See, I'd been gone for 8 days visiting my older sister in Missouri after her surgery, and before I left, that entrance didn't exist. Just an old gravel cut-through road running beside my south fence line. Quiet little patch of Tennessee land my grandfather bought back in 1958, long before anybody started slapping words like estates and luxury living onto farmland. But now there it was, a full-blown neighborhood entrance planted like a flag in the dirt. And the worst part wasn't even the gate itself. It was where they'd built it, 15 feet inside my property line. Not near it, not accidentally brushing against it. Dead on my land. I remember laughing when I realized it. Not because it was funny, but because sometimes people are so bold you almost gotta admire the stupidity of it. I put the truck in park, stepped out, and walked the fence line slow, boots crunching over frozen mud while I looked at the concrete footings they'd poured straight into ground my family had paid taxes on for nearly 70 years. And standing there in the cold, I already knew exactly who was behind it. Willow Creek Preserve. That neighborhood had been growing like mold for the last 5 years. Used to be open pasture where me and my cousins rode dirt bikes as kids. Then developers came in promising peaceful upscale country living, which apparently means cutting down every tree in sight and building 40 identical gray houses with fake shutters. And leading that whole circus was Diane Mercer, president of the HOA. Diane was the kind of woman who smiled with only the top half of her face. Always perfectly dressed, always talking like she was running for office, and somehow every conversation with her felt like a warning wrapped inside a compliment. We'd crossed paths a few times before the gate incident. Once when she came to my door asking if I'd consider repainting my roadside fence because, according to her, weathered gives the entrance corridor an abandoned look. I told her the fence was older than half her neighborhood and doing just fine. Another time she complained about my tractor being visible from the jogging trail. Said it disrupted the visual harmony of the community. I remember staring at her for a second wondering how someone survives adulthood using phrases like visual harmony with a straight face. But underneath all that polished suburban nonsense, Diane had one real problem with me. I didn't bend. Everybody else around there eventually sold off pieces of land to developers or agreed to HOA easements because the money got too tempting. But my father made me promise before he died that we'd keep the property whole if we could. Land's the only thing they're not making more of, he used to say. And I guess Diane took that personally. Because every year, Willow Creek got a little closer to my fence line. Every year there were more complaints, more friendly conversations, more pressure disguised as neighborly concern. Then while I was gone, they finally crossed the line. Literally. I walked back to my truck, pulled out the old survey map I kept folded behind the seat, and checked the markers myself even though I already knew what I'd find. The iron stake near the creek bed was still there exactly where my grandfather hammered it decades ago. The gate sat well inside it. That's when I noticed something else too, security cameras. 4 of them, mounted directly toward the road and partially facing my pasture. They hadn't just built on my property. They'd installed surveillance overlooking it. And suddenly this stopped feeling like some careless contractor mistake. This felt deliberate, territorial. Like they honestly believed nobody would challenge them because they had money, lawyers, and one of those shiny neighborhood signs with fake gold lettering. I stood there another minute listening to the hum of the gate motor opening for a white SUV, watching some guy in a Golf Polo drive through without even glancing at me. And I remember thinking, these people have absolutely no idea whose dirt they're standing on. Then I got back in my truck, started the engine, and drove straight toward the Willow Creek Clubhouse to meet Diane Mercer face to face. The Willow Creek Clubhouse looked exactly like the kind of place that charged $12 for iced tea and called it Southern hospitality. Fake stone walls, rocking chairs nobody actually used, little fountain out front trying real hard to look classy even though the water was green around the edges. I parked beside a row of polished SUVs and walked inside still wearing my mud-covered boots because honestly, I wanted those floors dirty. A young guy behind the front desk looked up at me like I'd wandered in by accident. I asked for Diane Mercer, and before he could answer, I heard her voice floating from down the hallway. Calm, polished. The kind of voice people use when they've spent their whole life getting away with things by sounding reasonable. She came around the corner holding a tablet and smiling that same fake neighborhood commercial smile I remembered. "Mr. Bennett," she said, "welcome back. I heard you were out of town." I held up the folded survey map. "Cute gate." Her smile twitched just a little. "Thank you. The residents are very excited about the new entrance." "Yeah," I said. "Problem is, your new entrance is sitting on my property." For half a second, I saw it in her eyes. Not surprise. Recognition. She already knew. But Diane recovered fast. People like her always do. She tilted her head slightly and gave me this practiced little sigh like I was being difficult in a customer service line. "I'm sure there's some misunderstanding with the contractor measurements." I handed her the survey papers. "There isn't." She barely glanced at them before giving them back. Moving the structure now would cost the association an enormous amount of money. Then she smiled again. "Maybe this is an opportunity for us to work together as neighbors." And there it was. That tone. That subtle rich people language where work together really means let us do whatever we want. I laughed a little under my breath and looked around the lobby. There were framed photos of neighborhood cookouts, yoga mornings, charity runs. All these carefully staged little moments pretending to be community. But none of those people had asked permission before pouring concrete onto my land. "You know what's funny?" I said. "You people spent millions building a luxury neighborhood, and not one of you thought maybe you should check where your property ends." Diane crossed her arms. "There's no need to make this adversarial. Bit late for that." Then she made the mistake that changed the whole thing. She leaned in slightly and lowered her voice. "Mr. Bennett, between us, the county barely enforces these boundary disputes unless someone gets aggressive. I'd hate for things to become unpleasant over a strip of unused land." Unused land. I swear something cold settled into my chest when she said that. Because to her it was just empty dirt. To me it was my father teaching me how to mend fencing at 14 years old. It was my grandfather smoking cigarettes on that hill after long days cutting hay. It was every dog we buried out near the cedar trees. People like Diane see land as numbers on paper. Folks like me see memory in the soil. But I didn't argue. Didn't raise my voice. In fact, I smiled. And that should have worried her. "You're right," I said calmly. "No reason for this to get unpleasant." Then I turned around and walked out. The whole drive home, I kept thinking about my dad. He wasn't an educated man in the traditional sense, but he understood leverage better than anybody I've ever met. One time when I was a kid, a logging company tried sneaking equipment across our property to shorten their route to the highway. Dad didn't scream or threaten lawsuits. He chained the access gate shut and rented them the crossing rights by the week until they finished the job. "Never stop somebody from needing what you own," he told me afterward. "That's where the value is." By the time I got home, I knew exactly what I was going to do. Next morning, I drove into town and had a massive metal sign printed. "Private property, access by written permission only." I planted it right beside their fancy new gate where every resident would see it pulling in. By lunchtime, my phone rang. "Diane." I let it ring twice before answering. "You're upsetting the residents," she said immediately. "Good," I told her. Then I hung up. But I was just getting started. That afternoon, I contacted a surveyor friend named Carl Henderson who'd worked county lines for 30 years and hated HOAs almost as much as I did. Carl came out with his equipment, checked everything twice, then actually whistled when he saw how far inside my line the construction went. "Buddy," he said, "these idiots didn't just clip your boundary. They bulldozed straight through it. We documented every inch. Drone photos, video footage, measurements, camera placement. Even the decorative shrubs they'd planted were technically trespassing." Then I filed an official encroachment complaint with the county zoning office along with evidence showing unauthorized construction on private land. 3 days later, County Inspector Harold Pike showed up at Willow Creek while residents were heading home from work. Now Harold wasn't a dramatic man. Skinny little guy with reading glasses and permanent heartburn, but he loved regulations the way priests love scripture. By the time he finished walking the site, the HOA had accumulated enough violations to make Diane's Botox sweat. Unauthorized commercial gate structure, boundary infringement, easement violations, unapproved surveillance orientation, daily accumulating fines if unresolved. Suddenly, the neighborhood Facebook page exploded. Residents were furious because nobody had told them the gate might be illegal. One homeowner apparently threatened to sue the HOA board personally. Another demanded access to financial records because rumors started spreading that Diane approved construction without final county verification just to rush the project before spring property tours. And that's when the panic started. 2 nights later, I was sitting on my porch drinking coffee when headlights rolled slowly up my driveway. Diane stepped out wearing jeans this time instead of her usual country club armor, which honestly told me more than anything else could have. She looked tired. Angry too, but mostly tired. "Can we talk?" she asked. I pulled out the chair across from me without saying anything. Crickets hummed out near the pasture while she sat down looking at the dark field behind my house. "The board's under pressure," she admitted finally. "Residents are threatening legal action." Sounds stressful. She ignored that. If the county escalates enforcement, the association could lose hundreds of thousands. Probably should have checked the property line then. Diane exhaled slowly. "You're enjoying this." I thought about it honestly before answering. Not really. And weirdly enough, that was true. Because underneath the irritation, underneath the satisfaction of finally watching somebody arrogant lose control, there was disappointment too. Small towns used to work differently. People talked before they built fences. Neighbors respected boundaries because they understood one day they might need each other. But now everything felt corporate. Sanitized. Like human decency got replaced by legal departments and landscaping committees. Diane studied me for a second like she was trying to decide whether I was bluffing. Then she finally asked the question she should have asked from the start. "What do you want?" I leaned back in my chair and listened to the gate motor humming faintly in the distance. Then I smiled a little. I said carefully, "it's time your neighborhood started paying rent." For a second, Diane just stared at me across the porch like she honestly couldn't tell whether I was joking. Then she laughed once, short and sharp. "You can't be serious." "Dead serious." I took another sip of coffee and slid a folder across the table toward her. I spent the afternoon talking to an attorney. Her expression changed immediately when she saw the paperwork. People like Diane trust documents more than people. "You built permanent structures on private property," I continued, calm as ever. "Now technically I could force removal, revoke access entirely, maybe even pursue damages for unauthorized land use." I shrugged. "But honestly, that sounds exhausting." She opened the folder slowly. Inside was a proposed land lease agreement drafted by my lawyer. Restricted roadway easement access. Renewable annually. Monthly payment terms. Liability protections. Default clauses. And my favorite part, if the HOA missed payments or violated terms, I reserved the right to terminate access to the gate immediately. Diane flipped through pages silently while the porch light buzzed overhead. $3,000 a month, she finally said. "That's insane. Demolition costs more." She looked up at me hard then, trying to find weakness somewhere in my face. "You planned this." "No," I said honestly. "You planned this when you poured concrete onto my property without asking." That landed. You could actually see it. The first crack in that polished executive mask she wore all the time. For the first time since I'd met her, Diane Mercer looked less like an HOA president and more like a woman who'd made a terrible mistake she couldn't spin her way out of. "The board will never agree to this," she muttered. "Then the county can keep fining you while you tear the whole thing down." I leaned forward slightly. "And Diane, once residents find out how much the removal's going to cost, they're going to start asking who approved construction before final verification." Silence. Thick silence. Somewhere out in the dark a dog barked. Finally, she closed the folder and stood up slowly. "You really don't like us much, do you?" I almost answered too quickly, but then I stopped myself because the truth was more complicated than that. "I don't mind people," I told her. "I mind entitlement." She looked at me another second, then walked back toward her SUV without another word. 3 days later, the HOA signed the lease. Not happily, of course. From what I heard, the emergency board meeting lasted almost 6 hours and included at least one screaming match, 2 resignation threats, and a retired dentist accusing Diane of running the neighborhood like a dictatorship. But in the end, math beat pride. Tearing down the gate and rebuilding it legally would have cost nearly 4 times more than leasing the land from me for the next decade. So they signed. And every month since then, Willow Creek Preserve has mailed me a very polite check for the privilege of using the entrance they never should have built in the first place. Funny thing is, life got quieter after that. Diane stopped sending complaints about my fence. Nobody cared about my tractor anymore. In fact, some residents actually started waving when they drove by. A few even apologized privately once word spread about what really happened. One older couple brought over peach cobbler during Christmas and admitted they'd voted against the gate project from the beginning because it felt too aggressive. Turns out not everybody inside those neighborhoods is a villain. Some people just buy houses and trust the wrong folks to make decisions for them. But Diane, she never really recovered socially after the incident. Technically, she kept her position another year, but the illusion was gone. Residents questioned everything after that. Landscaping budgets, security spending, contract approvals. Once people realize power can embarrass itself, they stop fearing it. About 6 months later, I saw her at the county feed store. First time since the lease signing. She looked different somehow. Less polished. More human. We ended up standing beside each other near the horse feed aisle in awkward silence until she finally sighed and said, "You know, I really thought you were bluffing." I chuckled a little. "That was your first mistake." Then she surprised me. "No," she said quietly. "My first mistake was thinking land was just land." I looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time I think she understood what people like my father spent their whole lives protecting. It wasn't acreage. It wasn't property values. It was identity, memory, the feeling that some piece of the world still belongs to your family after everything else changes around it. We talked another couple minutes after that. Not exactly friendly, but honest. And honestly, I respected her a little for showing up without the armor for once. Still took the checks though. Every single one. Sometimes in the evenings I'll sit on my porch watching headlights pass through that gate while the sun drops behind the cedar trees, and I think about how strange the whole thing really was. One bad decision by a group of people who got too comfortable assuming money solved everything. And now every resident in Willow Creek literally pays rent to the stubborn old landowner they used to complain about on Facebook. And I'll admit, every now and then when I drive through that entrance myself, I slow down just enough to appreciate the irony of seeing that polished stone sign sitting on land they swore belonged to them. The funniest part? Legally speaking, that gate is technically mine now. But here's the question I still think about sometimes. If somebody builds something beautiful on land they never had the right to touch, and the owner profits from it instead of tearing it down, did justice actually win? Or did everybody just find a more expensive way to live beside each other? Let me know what you think in the comments, because I've heard arguments both ways, and honestly, I still don't know the answer myself.